In this video, I'm going to demonstrate creating a pivot table. And pivot tables are just another tool that you can use in Excel to organize and summarize your data. Say, for example, the board of directors at the Lafourche Museum wanted to know the number of paintings, sculptures, etc. in each location that were in excellent, good, fair, and poor condition, and the appraised value for those items. So rather than trying to create a filter in our main table, what we can do is create a summary of that information with a pivot table. So to create the pivot table, I'm going to start out clicked somewhere in my Art Objects table. And then I'm going to go to the Insert tab, to the Tables group, and click on Pivot Table. And so it opens up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. And I want to make sure that the table range is Art Objects because that's what I've named my table. And I want to make sure that's going to be placed in a new worksheet. So I'm going to click OK, and this is the pivot table worksheet. And right now it looks pretty barren and pretty odd. So we'll start creating the pivot table here. The first thing that I want to do is to add some fields to my pivot table, and I do that over here in the pivot table field list. And so I'm going to add the location field, so I'm going to click that checkbox, and the appraised value field. And you'll notice now that when I did that, I now have a little pivot table over here, and I also have some things happening over here in the pivot table field list. I now have the location field in the row labels box, and the sum of appraised or the appraised value field in the values box. I'm going to go ahead and add category and condition as well. And so you see now I have a breakdown of the conditions of the various types of objects in each location. Now, this particular pivot table is quite long and perhaps not exactly what we want. So we'll fix that in a few minutes. Right now I'm going to go ahead and go to the Pivot Table Tools Design tab and apply a pivot table style to my pivot table. And I'm going to use the dark 4. And then I'm going to do some number formatting because these are dollar values here and we need the user to understand that. So I'm going to just click in this column and then go to the Pivot Tools Options tab. And over here in the Active Field group, I'm going to click on Field Settings. And I'm going to then, in the Value Field Settings dialog box, I'm going to click on Number Format. And in the Number Format list, it's just like the Format Cells dialog box that you're used to. I'm going to click on Currency, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And the last thing that I want to do here is to edit the name of that column because right now it's showing up as sum of appraised value, which really isn't informative. So I'm going to change that to total appraised value. And once I've made that change to the column name or to the field name, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And so my total appraised value field is now formatted correctly. Now, as I mentioned before, I've ended up with this big long table, which is a little bit hard to understand. So I'm going to do some rearranging over here to make it easier to understand. What I'm going to do is move the condition field up to the column labels. And the effect that that has is now the conditions fields are each a different column. So it gives me a smaller, more compact table, but it also makes that table easier to read, I think. So one thing I can also do with these pivot tables is to apply a layout like we did with the charts back in tutorial 4. So I'm going to go to the Pivot Table Tools Design tab, to the Layout group, and I'm going to go to the Report Layouts. And just for the sake of showing you some different ones, this is the tabular form, I believe it was called, and it just sticks in a little more space in between columns. Now I'm going to go ahead and move location up to the Report Filter dialog box, and that would be a way of compressing this information even more. Location now becomes just this control with a down arrow. And if I click on the down arrow, it shows me the different locations in the museum. So if I want to know about the items that are in the garden, I can simply click on Garden and click OK. And there I have a picture of what kinds of art objects are in the garden, how much they're worth, and how many are in excellent or good condition. When I'm done with that, I can remove the filter by clicking All, and it shows all the conditions of the various items for all of the locations. I'm going to go ahead though for the rest of this video and move location back down to the row labels, and I want to make sure that it comes before category because I want it this particular pivot table organized first by location. If I want a count of how many items are in each condition, I can add, for example, the title field, and I'm going to move it over here to the values because I want to be able to do exactly what it says here. I want to count each of these items. So you've probably noticed that it now says count of title here. And I want to change that to a more descriptive name, so I'm going to go back up to the Pivot Table Tools Options tab. And in the Active Field group, I'm going to click in the Active Field text box and just edit that so it says count, and this is just like doing the custom name that we did for total appraised value. So that changes all of those columns to say simply count. Okay. If I have a field added to my pivot table that I no longer want to include, I simply come back up to the field list here and unclick it. So I've removed the title field from the pivot table, and that takes out all of the count columns. So that's how you create a pivot table and how you set it up, format it, how you do the structure of it. You do need to kind of think this out beforehand before you start doing the pivot table. In fact, in your textbook, there's an illustration at the beginning of session 5.3 on page 271 that shows a sketch of the pivot table that we just created. That helps you to plan which fields should be row labels and which fields should be column labels and which field to use for the values. In the next video, I'm going to look at adding a slicer control. I'm going to look at refreshing the pivot table and grouping items in the pivot table.